Namaskar. Today I am going to read out for you an article from Al Jazeera. It is written by Hamid Dabashi. He is a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University. The title is White is Not a Color, White is an Ideology. The rising public conversations about race and racism in the United States have once again confused millions of well-meaning Americans into believing that if they look like what is now socially codified as a quote-unquote a white person, then they must feel guilty about the racist history of their country. This is a false guilt. Looking at any person and judging the content of their character based on the complexion of their skin is blatant racism predicated on a false and illogical premise. It is only white supremacists who benefit from the confusion of the term quote-unquote white as a color of skin designation with quote-unquote white as an ideology of racial supremacy. A reactionary propagandist named Christopher Rufo is now identified as the chief agent provocateur mobilizing racist Americans against a figment of their own imagination they call quote-unquote critical race theory by way of conflating racism with the designated color of a person's skin. The objective is to frighten people to think that if the color of their skin is coded as quote-unquote white in this country, then they are the targets of their so-called colored compatriots' demands for racial justice. But the word white in the context of talking about racism is not a signifier for skin color. In this vital context, white is an ideology. You are only white in this sense if you think you are entitled to certain privileges that must be denied to others whom you in the same breath call black, brown, red, yellow, etc. Racism is a construct. There is no such thing as race, none, quote unquote. This is how a master novelist late Toni Morrison broke it down very simply in a famous interview. She went, "Is the human race significantly anthropologically, scientifically, anthropologically. Racism is a construct, a social construct, and it has benefits. Money can be made off it. People who don't like themselves can feel better because of it. So it has a social function. But race can only be defined as a human being. Precisely in that sense, the word white is a signifier of that race. Each ideological register, each coded symbol, that is all. No human being at birth is white, black, brown, red, yellow, or any other color. They are all eventually coded with these colors to divide and rule them better. East Asians are called yellow, West Asians and Latinx brown, Native Americans red, Africans black. All of them set against the fictive centrality of the Caucasian white, which Europeans have racialized and reserved for themselves and give to their settler colonial extensions in North America or Australia as a signifier of superiority. The historical origin of all such racist designations come to a full quote-unquote scientific blooming during the period Europeans call, without the slightest sense of irony, their quote-unquote enlightenment. Racism is the color codification of the relation of power and abuse, precisely as sexism is the gendered codification of the self-same social malaise. Racism is a byproduct of the colonial conquest of the world for economic exploitations that needed a cultural alibi and ideological justification. If you think you are superior to other human beings because you are quote-unquote white, or you come from a superior civilization because you are quote-unquote white, then you are a racist. Namely, you assume you come from a fictitious race that is superior to other races, whom you therefore feel entitled to abuse and exploit. This is how the British ruled India, the French Algeria, the Belgians, Congo, etc. When Germans slaughtered tens of thousands of Africans in Namibia between 1904 and 1908, that was predicated on their sense of racial superiority. When they brought that genocide home and perpetrated it on Jews a couple of decades later, that was based on a sense of racial superiority. In yet another interview, Toni Morrison was asked if she would ever change and write books that quote-unquote incorporate white lives into them substantially. She looked at her interlocutor with a look of not contempt but piety. You can't understand how powerfully racist that question is, she asked, because you could never ask a white author when they are going to write about white people. Morrison here turning the racist question thrown at her against itself. The question is asked from the presumed epicenter of a position of power so assured of itself that is unconscious of itself. Morrison unveils that center, makes it conscious of itself, and exposes it for the sham that it is. No races before racism. Such encounters abound in the ideas of Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and others, where the ideological foregrounding of the very supposition of being quote-unquote white is questioned and exposed. But it is in her novel Marcy 2008 that Morrison went back to a point in American history when there was no American history, namely a time of fluidity in the continental social life before the racial codification of power surfaces in a manner that would be sustained for the rest of American history. Set in the late 17th century, Marcy maps out the continental domain where the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, and all of the Europeans had come to overrun the natives and begin importing African slaves before slavery and the coded color black, quote unquote, had become intertwined. In the book, The Gathering Destinies of Jacob Wark, an Anglo-Dutch trader, his wife Rebecca, slave girl Florence, Native American farm worker Lena, and a free African blacksmith whom Florence loves, details a whole different America before the rise of racism as the defining moment of American history.